Good evening, everyone. My name is André Plourde, and I am Dean of the Faculty of Public Affairs. I am proud to welcome you to the 2011 Dig, Ruth, and Judy Bell Lecture. Supported through the generosity of Dr. Ruth Bell and the estate of her late husband, the Honorable Richard A. Bell, the Bell Lectures recognize the important contributions of Ruth Bell, Dick Bell, and Judy Bell to the political life of this country. Upon being conferred the degree of Doctor of Laws by Carleton University in June 1984, Richard Bell received the following citation. Throughout his career, whether as a member of Parliament or as a private citizen, whether serving on the Ontario Law Reform Commission or when giving his advice as a member of the Board of Governors at this university, Richard Bell has shown a talent for politics in this best, necessary, and most important sense. He is one who has served his country well because of his belief in the capacity of a democracy to think. His wife, Dr. Ruth Bell, who has also received an honorary doctorate at the same convocation, has similarly served our country. Through this public lecture series that promotes rational thought on the political issues of the day, we recognize their joint service. And with Judy Bell's untimely death in 2000, it has been more than appropriate that this lecture series would be known as the Dick, Ruth, and Judy Bell Lecture on Public Policy. The daughter of Dick Bell, Judy followed in her father's footsteps in many respects. After being called to the Bar of Ontario, she practiced law with the firm of Bell Baker. She was appointed to the Supreme Court of Ontario in 1986. Judy was also very active in the community. She served, as had her father, on the Board of Governors of our university and as president of the Ottawa Civic Hospital Board. She was also particularly committed to the opening of the legal profession to women. We are delighted that Dr. Ruth Bell is here with us tonight. Her accomplishments and awards are many and impressive. She has been inducted into the Trinity College Honor Society at the University of Toronto. She has received the Governor-General's Award in commemoration of the Persons case. In 2007, she was honored as the YWCA Woman of Distinction Awards with a Lifetime Achievement Award. That same year, Dr. Bell established the Honorable Dick and Ruth Bell Chair for the study of Canadian parliamentary democracy here at Carleton. This created a prestigious new academic position in the Department of Political Science and thus opportunity for dedicated teaching and research into Canada's dynamic democratic system. In 2004, she published her memoirs entitled Be a Nice Girl, A Woman's Journey in the 20th Century. For her generosity, commitment, and dedication to the advancement of Carleton University and its values, Dr. Bell received Carleton's highest non-academic award, the Founders Award, at convocation ceremonies in June 2010. In May 2009, Dr. Bell was honored with the degree of Doctor of Sacred Letters from her alma mater, Trinity College, for her lifelong dedication to public service, education, and family, with an emphasis on the status of women. As you will see by reading the program notes, these are but a few of Dr. Bell's achievements. They are testimony to the contributions she has made and continues to make to public debate. Please join with me now in acknowledging her contributions to Carleton University and the larger community. Since 1992, the Bell Lectures series has given distinguished Canadians an opportunity to speak on matters of politics and public policy. We're very privileged this evening to have as our lecturer one of Canada's most accomplished and conscientious journalists, and an astute observer of both provincial and federal politics. To introduce him to you, I would like to call upon Chris Dornan, Associate Dean and Director of the Arthur Kroeger College of Public Affairs. Chris? It is indeed my pleasure this evening to introduce our speaker, Steve Paikin, anchor and senior editor of TV Ontario's flagship current affairs program, The Agenda with Steve Paikin. One of the essential elements of a mature and moral political collective is the opportunity to examine, discuss, debate, and inform its own affairs. Democracy doesn't reside simply in the periodic exercise of the franchise at the polls. Democracy resides in a fractious, rolling, unruly conversation about how we wish to be governed, where our priorities should lie, what we consider to be in the best interests of the common good. Authoritarian societies are all command and control. Democracy, properly exercised, is just one big argument. And so we need venues where that argument can be conducted by informed citizens and in civil tones. Not to freight too much on the shoulders of what is ultimately a panel discussion program, but TV Ontario's The Agenda is exactly what democracy ordered. 5 nights a week, 60 minutes a night, devoted to detailed and spirited discussion of topics from the most pressing political issues to items of just cultural interest. You may not watch it every night, but you should thank your stars that it's there, and that TVO makes the commitment to such a program. Of course, it's not simply enough to provide the space for a daily discussion of political affairs. In the United States, Glenn Beck had an hour of airtime every weeknight to address the nation via Fox News. But screeching to the converted is not the same as allowing different views to contest one another in a forum of adversarial respect. What you need is a moderator, an interlocutor, who will set the tone and guide the conversation. Ideally, this person should be whip-smart, perceptive, possessed of a wry sense of humor, an infectious curiosity, and a humbling near encyclopedic knowledge of whatever topic happens to be at hand. Ideally, what you want is Steve Paikin. Good thing we've got one. He's an exceptionally keen student of Canadian politics and politicians, having written 3 books on the subject, the most recent a biography of John Robarts, former Premier of Ontario. And it's a measure of his standing as a journalist that he was selected to moderate the English language leaders' debates in the 2011, 2008, and 2006 federal elections. Why? Because of his calm, his judgment, his respect for opposing viewpoints, his ability to capture what the public is thinking, and the fact that he does not take himself too seriously. I dare say we might be better off if more of our politicians shared those qualities. Because despite the title of the program over which he presides, beyond informing and enlivening the public debate, Steve Paikin has no agenda. Ladies and gentlemen, Steve Paikin.
There's only one way to follow that introduction. Thank you and good night. No one's going to be able to live up to that, Chris, but I will do my best, and I can see I'm already off to a bad start because I've made a faux pas already. I have brought my speech tonight, I've just noticed, in a folio of my alma mater, Victoria University in Toronto, which, well, a couple of applause, that's pretty good. But I am at Carleton, right? So maybe that wasn't such a good idea. No. Except that I think your president actually came from Victoria College as well. So it seems that a few good things come from Vic. So I'm feeling a little more comfortable about my choice on the folio this evening. I do want to thank Dr. Bell so much for the singular honor of being able to do this evening. I've never done anything like this before. And to be able to do it here is really a great, great honor. And you told me earlier, Dr. Bell, that you yourself asked for me to be here, and Chris extended the invitation, and I'm really very, very touched about that. And can I also be, I think, the first person tonight to wish you next week happy birthday. So we'll do that right now. And I'm, of course, sworn to secrecy about what number you're going to hit, but I will tell this audience, just entre nous, a little older than me. Just a little bit, but that's all I'm going to say. And wow, all those honors from Trinity College, that really is quite spectacular. Couldn't get into Vic, eh? Okay, that's it. No, it's okay, it's okay. I want to embarrass a couple of other people before I get into my remarks here, and one of them is Chris Waddell, whom all of you in this room know. Chris and I worked together at CBC many, many, many moons ago, and while I have great memories of my 7 years at CBC and have great memories of working mostly with very wonderful people there, you were actually one of the truly great people to work with, a guy with just a lot of integrity, and any of you who have his class here or are under his umbrella or influence, I think should consider yourselves fortunate, because he is really one of the great people at what he does. So Chris, it's a pleasure to see you again. And I'm going to embarrass you too, because my best buddy in the world, David Lockhart, is here tonight. David and I met more than 30 years ago at the University of Toronto, and I think it's perfectly ridiculous that all these years later, you not only watch the program that I do, but you actually come out to hear what I've got to say. That's friendship, because he's heard it all before, I'm sure, but that's friendship. David, thank you, and it's a pleasure to see you tonight, of course. Applause. I don't know, Dr. Bell, if you realize this in inviting me here this evening, but you've kind of, I think, broken the rules in a rather significant way by proffering this invitation, because I did go to the website to see what kind of people get this kind of invitation. And it says, speakers may include individuals who have been active in politics or public service, or distinguished scholars in political science. So I'm going to look into that. Active in politics? No, never. Never belonged to a political party, never run for anything, never put a lawn sign up, don't tell people who I vote for, so that's not it. Distinguished scholars in political science. Do I look like a distinguished scholar in political science? No. In fact, I think the aforementioned David Lockhart can confirm that I am not a distinguished scholar in political science, because he and I took political science at U of T 30 years ago, and while the distinguished scholars in political science were trying to teach us political science in the front of the room, he and I were at the back of the classroom writing hockey trivia questions to each other. And there was not a lot of distinguished political scholarship being imparted in those classes. However, we got pretty good at hockey history, if I may say. And can we just use this opportunity to see if he's still on his game? David. Who was the goaltender for the New York Americans in the 1930s? Roy Waters. He knows it. Unbelievable. How about a hand for this guy? Isn't that amazing? Yes. He still knows. Born in Toronto, nicknamed Shrimp because at 5'3", he was the smallest person ever to play in the NHL, and you thought you wouldn't learn anything here tonight. There you go. In all seriousness, I am glad, Dr. Bell, that you broke the rules for me tonight, because truth be told, I think, David, you and I probably did learn a thing or two in our classes, because you did go on to work in the leader of the opposition, John Turner's office, and you did go on to write 6 budget speeches for Paul Martin when he was finance minister, and I have gone on to report on, cover, and yes, enjoy watching politics in this country professionally for almost 30 years, so maybe a thing or two beyond the hockey trivia did stick in those classes. Over the last 3 decades, I've had a chance to see many fascinating things in politics, seen some great stories, seen some terrible stories, seen some heartwarming stories, seen some heartbreaking stories, and everything in between, and I'd like to share a few of them with you here tonight. David's a speechwriter, and I'm sure he would advise me that the best way to start is with a joke. So this is the best joke about politicians I've heard. Politicians are like diapers. They should be changed frequently and for the same reason. That's not bad, eh? I want to take you back 25 years. Bill Davis had just retired as the Premier of Ontario, the longest-serving Premier of Ontario in the 20th century. And my job at CBC at the time was to go to Mr. Davis's office at Torrey, Delorier and Binnington. How's that for an appropriately named law firm for him? And a woo for Tories, how about that? And find out, is there going to be any life after politics for William Davis? He'd been in public life since Leslie Frost was premier. He'd been in there for 25 years, 14 of them as premier. So we set up all the camera equipment, we did the interview, and I have to be honest, it wasn't the most scintillating interview I've ever done in my life. Mr. Davis had a habit, which I'm not sure he's really broken, of circumlocution. He loved to talk in circles. He would never quite actually get to the point. You'd sit there in a scrum with him for 20 minutes, you'd go back and listen to your tape afterwards, you'd look for a clip, and God bless you, you couldn't find anything. But that was the way Mr. Davis spoke. And that's kind of the way the interview went. We talked about this, we talked about that. He never really gave me any fabulous answers. And after the interview was over, we were tearing down the lights, putting away the camera equipment, and I just sort of accidentally said to him, you know, this job you've got right now just must be the best job you've ever had. I mean, you are on 15, 16 different boards of directors. You're a corporate lawyer in one of the best law firms in the country. You are making way more money now than you ever made when you were premier. You see your grandchildren now more than you saw your own kids when you were premier. You've got a sane life. You don't have to worry, as you did for 6 years in the minority government days, that your job was going to be over at the end of the day. This must be the best job you've ever had. Cameras off, crew going away. He says to me, Stephen, let me tell you something. This job of corporate lawyer on the most fascinating day can't touch being Premier of Ontario on the dullest. And that was my reaction. I went, huh? Really? What? Did I just hear that right? What is it about that job? What is it about the seductive call of politics that made a guy who seemed to me to have everything he wanted right now say that that job he once had, which I thought looked so difficult and so miserable most of the time, made that such a perfect job for him? I just tucked that little quote away in the back of my head, and it just sort of sat there for about 15 years, till I got a letter out of the blue from a literary agent who said, have you ever want to write a book? And I said, actually, I got this idea that's been percolating in the back of my head for 15 years, but trust me, no one's going to be interested in this book. And he said, well, what do you think it is? And I said, I want to talk about all the good and noble reasons why people want to go into public life, because as the Army says, there's no life like it. And they said, well, that could be a tough sell, but write up a proposal and let's see how we do. So I did, and the literary agent shopped it around, and much to my shock and I guess ultimately dismay, Penguin Publishing said they wanted it, which meant I actually had to put my money where my mouth was now and go out and write it. So I went out and I interviewed about 100 different politicians from all parts of the country, all different vocations, all ages, demographics, regions, sexual orientations, everything. I wanted to get a better understanding of the different experiences that people had in politics and what drew them to this very seductive life. And I ended up calling the book The Life, The Seductive Call of Politics. The expression the life came from Frank McKenna. I was talking to him one day, and he just talked about, even though he had a very good public life, he talked about how much I missed the life. So I called the book The Life. And what kinds of experiences did people have in politics? Well, there were quite a variety, actually. There were people who got into public life because they were genuinely altruistic. They just wanted to do well by others. They didn't really care about self-interest at all. And believe it or not, they're not all New Democrats. They actually span different parties. There are people who got into public life because they've had this dream since they were a child of being premier or prime minister. And the funny thing is, I got a kid now who's got this disease. And some of you in this room, Victoria, I don't know where you are. Yeah, it's amazing how many places I go nowadays and say, are you Zach Paikin's dad? And I say, yeah, I didn't think this would happen that quickly because he's only 20, but yeah. I remember the moment. I've always taken my kids with me on the hustings because I want them to see how democracy works. And it was the 1999 Ontario election, and then opposition leader Dalton McGuinty was giving a speech on top of a picnic table in Oakwood riding. Mike Cole was the local member there running for office, and my 8-year-old son was looking up at Mr. McGuinty, and I could just see the wheels spinning. And from that moment on, I could tell a seed had been planted, and the kid, something was going on. And today he's running for National Policy Chair of the Liberal Party of Canada. And of course, I'm scrupulously neutral in these matters and have no interest in how the outcome goes, but he is an example of someone who's been bit by the bug and has the childhood dream. Politics can be a family affair, and I think one of the best families that I ran into on this issue were the Johnson family of Quebec. I still have yet to meet a more extraordinary family when it comes to public life. Daniel Johnson, the father, was Premier of Quebec. Pierre-Marc Johnson, one of the sons, was Premier of Quebec. Daniel Johnson Jr., another son, was Premier of Quebec. And it gets better. They all three represented three different parties in becoming Premier of Quebec. That's really something. And I can remember talking to Pierre-Marc, and I was saying, what did you think of politics when you were growing up? And he said, we hated it. And my brother and I, Daniel, always said we would never do this because our father was always away. We never saw him. And then he died. Daniel Johnson Sr. died quite prematurely. And suddenly, I'll give you a more current example that many of you would know. It was a Trudeau-like funeral. It was a Rocket Richard-like funeral. They were lined up around the block in Quebec to pay their respects to Daniel Johnson Sr. And suddenly a light went on for these two brothers. And they thought, boy, there's something about the way our dad touched people's lives that will have to make us reevaluate our thoughts on this. And they did, and of course they both became Premier. I think of accidental candidates, people who had no intention whatsoever of getting into public life, but did. And one of the better examples I ran into was a woman who I spent many a week with at TVO. Her name was Ruth Greer, and she used to be on a program we did called Fourth Reading, which all of you, of course, know in politics in this room, every bill gets 3 readings before it becomes law. We were fourth reading. If it was a football show, we'd have called it the fifth quarter, same kind of thing. And Ruth Greer was told back in 1972 to run for municipal politics. Why? Because her husband, Terry, was running for Parliament at the same time. The elections were happening within just a couple of weeks of each other. And the New Democratic Party people went to Ruth and said, look, we don't care if you win and we don't really care what you stand for, but if your name is up on campaign signs at the same time, that'll give Terry an added boost. The Greer name will be out there. So you run and do this. And she said, I can't run. I got 4 kids. I have no time to do this. I'm volunteering for a number of things. I can't do it. They said, well, Ruth, don't you want your husband to win? Don't you want to be helpful? So they guilt-tripped her into it. And so she ran. And of course, the funny thing is that Terry ran in 72 and won, but then in 74 in the next election, he lost, and that was the sum total of his political career, electively speaking. And Ruth had 20 years in, 10 years in Etobicoke Council, 10 years as an NDP cabinet minister at Queen's Park, completely by accident. There are people who get into this game because they like the game. There are people who love public policy. Anyway, you get the drift. There's lots of different reasons why people get in. I wrote it up in a book, and much to my shock, it became a bestseller. So, can you imagine a book about politicians in Canada that doesn't portray all of them as somehow venal and corrupt, and it became a bestseller? Who'd have figured? I was shocked. Penguin was shocked. And I know Penguin was shocked because when they asked me to write the sequel, when you have a book and you have the front cover and then you pull the cover off and there's a little dust jacket and the publicity people write a little something about why you should buy this book. And in the second book, which I'll tell you about in a second, it opened up with the following words. In his surprise bestseller, Steve Paikin wrote out. So they had enormous high hopes for the book too, as you could tell. I want to go back to the year 1999 because this begins the other side of the story. And I want to talk to you about a guy named Michael Bryant, who I think is a name that many people in this room will know. Michael Bryant was, I think, about a 32-year-old, I was going to say kid, but I guess he was. I mean, he was a short, young-looking 32-year-old kid who came up to me at some event at Queen's Park, and he's got kind of a hop in his step when he walks. He walked up to me and said, "How you doing, Steve? My name's Michael Bryant. I just wanted to introduce myself because I'm going to run for the nomination in St. Paul's riding for the Liberals. I'm going to beat the sitting cabinet minister, and I'm going to be the next MPP for St. Paul's." And I looked at him, and I, was polite, but I said to myself, not a chance. I said to myself, it sure looks like Mike Harris is going to win a second consecutive majority government. And it sure looks like the cabinet minister that you're going to run against, Michael, is not going to have any trouble beating you again. So nice to meet you, and I'll see you somewhere down the road. Well, son of a gun, election night, 1999, Mike Harris is reelected. Almost all of his cabinet is reelected, except for the minister in St. Paul's, Isabel Bassett, who would go on to become my boss, so we did okay too. Michael Bryant became the next MPP for St. Paul's, and I was surprised. I shouldn't have been, but I was. But 6 months later, he was appearing on a program I used to do for TVO called Studio 2. And he shows up, and I see him in the green room ahead of time, and I say to him, holy cow, Michael, there you are. I can't believe it. You did it. You said you were going to do it, and you did it. Congratulations. How's it going? All of a sudden, all the color leaves his face. He turns white as a ghost. And he says, Steve, you can't believe it. I never would have imagined it. The backstabbing, the disloyalty, the internecine warfare, and you know what? What I said. I love it! But it did get me thinking. Not everybody loves it as much as Michael did, but what about the other side of public life? What about the betrayals? And what about the meteors who blast onto the scene and then crash and burn? How about the people who get crushed in the media onslaught? People whose family life is massively disrupted? People who lose through no fault of their own? People who can't get a job after they're out of politics? We don't hear a lot about this, but these things happen all the time. So off I went, did several dozen more interviews, and got the next book going, called The Dark Side. The political price, what did I call it? The personal price, thank you, of a political life. Sometimes that personal price comes in the form of, did that person really say that to me? Saskatchewan Premier Roy Romano told me this story about where he was running for re-election and lost. And he's at his tennis club one day, of all places, where you would expect, when you're standing naked in the locker room getting ready to go out there, people might cut you a bit of slack. But somebody walked up to him in the locker room one day and said, aren't you Roy Romano? And he said, yes, hi, how you doing? And the other guy said, good thing we got rid of you. Now that's, I think, a bit much. I think that's a bit much. It gets worse. There's a guy I met several years ago named Brian O'Curley. Some of you in this room might know him. He's not a name that necessarily you would know. He was a teacher in Alberta. He did a lot of volunteering for the Conservative Party in the back rooms, riding association representative, that kind of thing. Loved politics, never ever considered running. One day in the leading up to the 1988 election, his hero, Peter Lougheed, says to him, you know, Brian, there's going to be a bunch of new ridings created, and you ought to stand for one of them. You've been in the party for a long time, you're liked, you're respected, you've always been in the back rooms, but you should try this. And so on the basis of this recommendation from Peter Lougheed, he went for it. And of course, being a Tory in Alberta then, you win the nomination, you pretty well got the seat. He got the nomination, he won the election, he became the newly minted Member of Parliament for Elk Island. Well, he thought his fantastic political career was just about to begin, and in fact, boy, was it crazy. Brian had 4 kids. Brian had a wife. Brian spent much of his time in Ottawa while his family was back in Alberta. He would come home on Friday night with a bag of laundry over his shoulder. He would kiss his wife and kids, and that's the last he would see of them on the weekends, because when you're home, you're never really home. You've got events all weekend long, and they got them stacked up one after another on you. And then, after being home on the weekends, he would hop the red eye Sunday night back to Ottawa, and that's what he did, over and over and over, week after week after week. After a couple of years of this, they decided this was no way to run a family. And so they decided to move to Ottawa. Now that is a decision that on the one hand is good for your family life, because you end up in your own home at the end of the day with your wife and kids, but it's a very dangerous decision in terms of what's going on back home. Because while you are there, other stuff is going on back home, and if you all remember the chronology of this, while the Progressive Conservatives were doing their thing in Ottawa back in the late 80s, early 90s, the Reform Party was doing some organizing back in Alberta. And we all remember what happened in that 1993 election. How many seats did the Tories end up with? 2, correct, good crowd. And guess what? Brian O'Curley wasn't one of them. So, keep in mind here, he's won 1 term. So what does that mean? No pension, exactly. For all the people who think these guys are a bunch of fat cats, no pension. He says to himself, I lived my life, most of my life in Alberta. We'll just move back there and we'll get a job. I'll go back to being a teacher. They move back to Alberta. Can't get a thing. Guess what? Anybody who has the patina of being a progressive conservative is box office poison. No one wants to touch them. It's all about reform now. And so they move back to Ottawa. One day, when he was a member of Parliament, he was representing the government of Canada at the Earth Summit in Rio, rubbing shoulders with the German Chancellor Helmut Kohl. The next day, he cannot get a job. And he went for a year trying to get a job as a teacher, what he knew best. And eventually he did. He got a part-time supply teaching job teaching kindergarten. And he was grateful, because it's tough out there. I want to tell you another story. And this is a story that, this one's a hard one to tell. I know this lady very well. Her name was Priscilla de Villiers. Her name is Priscilla de Villiers. And the reason I know her is because her daughter went to the same school as I did in Hamilton. And one day, her beautiful 16, 17-year-old daughter was coming home from school, and somebody who was out on parole killed her. And it prompted Priscilla to take that rage and anger that she felt and channel it into something constructive. And what she did was she created a group called Caveat, which was essentially a group that would look out for the rights of victims of violence. Now today, this is conventional wisdom in our country. But I'm telling you, when this happened many, many years ago, the justice system was very focused on the rights of the accused. It was not as interested in the rights of victims. And Priscilla de Villiers was one of those people who got victims' rights put on the front burner of this country. She became quite influential in the Mike Harris government, as it then was, of Ontario. And it soon became apparent that she had an interest in not just influencing the public agenda, but really trying to shape it more from the inside. And so a by-election came up in the year 2000, around where she lived in Hamilton, and she decided to seek, and she won the Conservative nomination for that fight. Well, much to Priscilla's dismay, the issue in that campaign was not what you have done for victims of violence. The issue was the super city that was in the process of being created because of municipal amalgamation in Hamilton and the surrounding regions. People who are from Toronto or might remember that Toronto was called the mega city in Toronto. They called it the super city in Hamilton. And one of the things that Priscilla learned is that once you're a candidate for office, everything is fair game. And Priscilla, as often happens when couples lose a child, got divorced. And apparently the Hamilton Spectator thought that was an important enough story to put in 60-point type in their newspaper. Candidate in this by-election going through divorce. That might be one reason why people don't want to be in public life. She lost the election, needless to say. It was a tough fight. It was about the super city. It wasn't about helping victims of crime. And after the election was over, just to sort of put a capper on what was a hellacious period of her life, she fell down a flight of stairs and broke her leg. She's had a tough go. Thankfully, Mike Harris did come to her assistance. She became special advisor to the Ontario Office for Victims of Crime. In 2006, she was appointed to the Advisory Committee on Victims Issues, to the Policy Center on Victims Issues in the Department of Justice. And if anybody complains that she got her job because of patronage, I would say, damn right she did, and she deserved it. I want to tell you one more story. One more story about a guy who had a very tough go in public life, and then it got worse. I've saved this one for last, in part because it's probably the most tragic story I know of anybody who is in public life, and it has local application. I think many of you in this room may remember this man. Hans Daegler, who was a member of the Ontario legislature. He won his seat, I think it was either the 87 sweep that David Peterson won or 1990, the year Bob Rae won. He was the Liberal member for Nepean. But he didn't last long, and in 1995, when the Harris Common Sense Revolution came in, John Baird defeated him. Some of you in this room may know John Baird. I think that name rings a bell. Hans Degler discovered how unloved ex-politicians can be. He couldn't get a job. The phone stops ringing. People who always said to you, you know what, when your political career is over, come talk to me. We've got a seat on a board with your name on it. We've got a job with your name on it. Stop taking his call. He became very depressed. And 4 months after suffering that defeat at the polls, he took his own life. He just felt he was a failure and couldn't provide for his family anymore. And so he killed himself. He kept talking about this invisible tattoo that he wore, an invisible tattoo that kind of marked you as an ex-politician and therefore, in some sense, damaged goods. That invisible tattoo that wouldn't go away. And he took what for him was an awful but profound way out of his misery. I am, what am I saying? I'm actually not urging you to be overly sympathetic to politicians. They do enough stupid and dumb things on occasion to make us not want to have any sympathy for them. And they did make the decision to get involved. And most of them, even after they've gotten out of politics, when you ask them, would you ever run again? They still say, I wouldn't say never. And I saw Brian O'Curley not too long ago, and despite everything he's been through, I said, Brian, would you ever run again? And he said, I have no plans to run again, and I don't think so, but I never can completely shut the door. It's just amazing. Even if you've been to hell and back, for some people, it's a very important job. It's a very fun job. It may be, in some cases, the best job they ever have in their lives. But it can also be brutal, and it can also be soul-destroying, and it can also take away any sense of self-worth you may have for months. And I think if you did a check of all of those who lost in the election earlier this year federally or earlier this year provincially, you would find some really sad stories. And I encountered one of them just the other day. I wanted to do a story on, in the last Ontario election, 4 cabinet ministers lost their job. And I actually wanted to do a show where I had all 4 of them come on and talk about, what did you accomplish? Was it worth it? What are you going to do now? And I called John Wilkinson, who was a huge upset defeat. I mean, this guy, if you can imagine, was Mr. HST. Look what happened in British Columbia when they brought in the HST, right? Government almost fell, demonstrations in the streets, political career of Bill Vander Zalm resurrected, all because of the HST, destroyed a premier. Gordon Campbell was toast because of it. Did you notice that none of those things happened in Ontario? You know why? Because John Wilkinson's a damn good salesman. And John Wilkinson was the minister responsible for getting the HST through, and he did. And there were no demonstrations in the streets, and the government didn't fall, and Dalton McGuinty is still the premier, and they owe that to John Wilkinson. And on election night, he lost. And I called him up and I said, I want you to come on the agenda and talk about your experience. And I'll never forget his answer. He said, Steve, I have never yet seen anybody on your program break into tears, and I don't intend to be the first. He said, I can't have that happen. It's way too soon. This was 2 weeks after the election. He said, way too soon. So, it's not a bad thing to remember, after these folks lose an election, that the vast majority of them are not the scum of the earth. They are just trying to make their little postage stamp-sized piece of the globe a little bit better, and they oftentimes pay a hell of a price for doing so. And that, my friends, is your Bell Lecture for 2011. Thanks for inviting me. All the best. Annie, okay, good to meet you.
Student in public policy, and my question is really, you spoke broadly about the political life, and do you see a shift in terms of women in politics? And over your term and watching politics, has that changed the prices that women pay, and where do you see it moving in the future?
First of all, where it's going in the future, I have no idea, because I never make predictions about anything. And I learned never to make predictions back in 1990 when Bob Rae became premier. I said, it's something I never thought I'd ever see in my life, so I'm stopping the prediction game. But I know this is unpopular to say, but I'm going to say it anyway. I think public life is way harder on women than it is on men. And I know everybody wants to believe that things are sort of equal, but the reality is, I've talked to too many female politicians who say, I serve at Queen's Park, I serve in Parliament, and I work my 80-hour weeks doing that, and then I come home and I'm still expected to do the second shift, which is taking care of the family. And I don't think it works that way for men. Men obviously pitch in more, but I don't think there's any, I don't think it's a coincidence that we don't see young women with young children in public life, because it's just too hard. It's easier to do, obviously, if you live in a riding. If you're an MP and you live in a riding around Ottawa, it's easier to do. If you're a member of the Ontario legislature and you live around Toronto, it's easier to do. I have no clue how people keep their lives together if they live in Alberta or British Columbia or Saskatchewan or the Yukon. How do you do all that? It's just astonishing. I remember I'll leave it there. I remember talking to Audrey McLaughlin about this kind of stuff, and she didn't have kids, but the whole idea of trying to live her life here and then take a whole day to get home and somehow still be able to do her job was, I always found that very surprising. So I think it's harder on women, and for that reason, yes, politics is more woman-friendly today, but it's still probably not woman-friendly enough, particularly, or mother-friendly enough, to get more people to do it. We're closer, but not there.
Okay, so I was basically saying I'm a huge fan of the show, and I'm curious to know what Steve's week is like in regarding preparation of the show, because it seems like it requires a lot of work and a lot of prep, and I'm just wondering, are you reading all the time to ask the great question you asked?
I can tell how busy my job gets when I go to a baseball game, because if it's pretty busy, I'm reading between innings. And if it's busier, I'm reading between batters. And if it's really busy, I'm reading between pitches. The truth is, I read all the time. And the hour of the day where you actually do the show is probably, the most fun and the easiest part of it to do. The fact is that for 16 years, I did the agenda and then Studio 2 before it, live at 8 o'clock at night. So the day started early and ended pretty late, and didn't allow for a lot afterwards. The good thing about what happened this year is that we tape the show now in the afternoon, which is a godsend. We discovered that since we're really not on the agenda slaves to what's happening in the paper that day or the events necessarily of that day. It's a program whose subject matter has, I think, a lot more shelf life than most daily shows. We discovered we really could tape things earlier, and we didn't have to be live to catch whatever was breaking that night to do it. So we do that now, which allows some family time in the evening, and then once everybody's asleep, from about 9:30 to midnight, I get most of my good reading done. And then you do it every day. And fortunately, I have been blessed with an insatiable curiosity about how the world works. So I don't mind doing that much reading. But that's it, essentially.
Thanks.
Yeah. Yes, please.
So my name's Andrew. I'm a 2005 graduate of Kroeger College, so I wanted to say thanks very much for organizing this. I used to come to them as a student back in the day. Steve, watched the show, and I feel usually it's jogging, so to actually see you in person is great. It's a little bizarre. Steve, how do you, you've written the 2 books on it now. Where are the secrets in terms of balance? So if there are those on the not so positive side that sounded it was really kind of really quite, there's a man who committed suicide in the end. But for all of those that really were able to not only throw themselves fully into it and get a lot out of it, how did they, some of the lessons they learned, how they struck a balance between personal life, maybe watching baseball, as you always remind us that you like to do. How do they do it? And if you have any tips, that'd be great.
I actually talked to Stockwell Day about this about a year ago, and one of the things he said was that he realized very quickly that if he didn't put his foot down right away, his staff would schedule every second of his waking hours. And so the first thing he did was he plugged into his schedule on the weekends, here's what I'm doing in terms of family time. I'm doing this, I'm doing this, I'm doing this. Schedule all around that if you want, but these are inviolable. And he stuck to it. And it's one thing to, the funny thing is, every politician assumes that if they don't do 8 events on a Saturday and 8 events on a Sunday, they can't possibly get reelected because they need to, establish those links in the community. And the sad reality is, and Chris, I think you'd back me up on this, the sad reality is the local member nowadays, to a greater or lesser extent, doesn't have a lot of influence in the outcome. The fact of the matter is, you're going to all those events, you think it's going to save your bacon at the end of the day because, after all, I have a personal relationship with these people. Of course they're going to support me even if they don't like the leader. Or of course they're going to vote for me even if they don't like the platform. Well, guess what? They aren't. And there are lots of liberals who found that out in the last federal election, right? Who thought, my own personal popularity will hold. I live in Toronto. A lot of liberals went down in Toronto thinking their own personal connection, all those hours attending all those events would in the end pay off. They didn't. Other bigger factors matter more. So it's a good idea to carve out that time and stick to it, because in the end, missing that 1 or 2 or 3 events over the course of a weekend and spending that time with your family is more important. Over here.
Hi, my name's Patricia Joy.
Hello, Patricia.
Hello. And
Your middle name seems quite appropriate to your demeanor.
I've heard that before.
It's a good way to be.
I'm too short. My question is to deal with, so you've interviewed and talked with a lot of politicians from a lot of different ridings. What are some of the challenges that more local MPs to Ottawa, or to, I guess, the Toronto ones around Queen's Park, have had in differences with their public life as, to other ones who live, further away, because they would have, as you mentioned, a lot of distance challenges. But what are some of the things that arise that you have found for MPs who live close to their parliament?
I don't see that as being particularly challenging. That's a great advantage if you can live close to where your seat of government is. Everybody's got, different challenges in their life relating to all sorts of different things, but geography is a huge benefit to having as normal a life as you possibly can. If you can drive home and sleep in your own bed 7 nights out of 7, generally speaking, that's just a huge advantage to still being married by the time your political career is over. It just is. And I won't say any more because I think everybody in this room knows more examples of people who just couldn't make it work. There's too much distance. They spend too much time apart. And eventually that catches up for some people. It's a truly unique couple that can spend 2/3 of the year apart, and even when they're together, not really be together and survive. And I know one of the things, I saw Preston Manning a couple of weeks ago at something, and I remember telling him that I read in his book, which I think was called Think Big, the thing that surprised me the most, he has one of the great, from an outside point of view, he has one of what appears to be the great marriages of anybody who's been in politics. He and his wife have been together for, I think, 40 years or something, and even though he spent so much time away from his wife while he was in public life, they're still together. But even he, the two of them, evangelical Christians, social conservatives who believe deeply in marriage, even he talked in the book about how hard it was to keep his marriage together in those years. Now, if you don't have that faith in either God or yourself or whatever going for you, you can imagine just how much tougher it is. It's tough. Thank you for that, Patricia Joy. Over here.
Hi there, my name is Marina von Stackelberg, and I'm a third-year journalism student here at Carleton.
Marina?
Yeah.
Hi.
And often in a lot of our classes, we discuss changes in the profession of journalism. So I just wanted to ask you what advice you have for future journalists.
Can I see a show? How many future journalists do we have in this room? We've got a few, eh? Okay. I will tell you what the dean of the journalism program at the J School I went to told me when I asked him this very same question 29 years ago. And his answer was, you can do anything and everything. You are flexible. It doesn't matter what the subject matter is, you know enough about it that you can go out and cover something on it. You want to do and can do everything and anything. And that's why it goes back to that other gentleman's question, Andrew's question. You've got to read all the time. All the time. I know this drives my wife crazy, but from the second I get up in the morning, maybe 20 seconds later I got a newspaper in my hand. And that won't be the only newspaper I read that day. And then before I go to bed at night, I'm going to be reading some book of some, and actually the one I'm reading now is by a Carleton prof, Paul Litt, about John Turner, this new book, which is terrific. I'm going to be reading some book, if not for an interview I'm about to do, then just to get more knowledge on something. Read all the time. Cover as much as you possibly can. Do as much as you possibly can. Are you doing an internship right now? Hopefully. You got plans to do one?
Yeah.
Do one. Do as many as you can. And just get that experience. You can't get too much experience at your stage of the game. Squeeze every drop out of the lemon. Thanks, Marina.
Hi there, my name's Elliot.
Hi, Elliot.
So, two-part question for you, all relating around the subject. You mentioned before the harsh reality of the political world and how it's hard to be a politician. On the other side of it, we have a very distrustful interpretation of politicians. So I'm just wondering, my first question is, which reality is worse? Is our interpretation of the political world too harsh, or is it just a backstabbing realm? As well, the second part of the question is...
Hold on, one at a time, one at a time.
Well, they're connected.
Oh,
So,
all right.
The other part of the question is, in reference when we're always talking about politics and our interpretation of it, there's always a reference to this golden age of politics, and I'm just wondering if you ever believed that it existed.
Okay, those are two separate questions, and I'm not going to remember the first one, so I'm going to remember the second one first. To some extent, there is an exaggeration about the golden age, because everybody thinks, of course, the system they came up in and lived through in their 20s and 30s was the golden age. But in this case, I really believe there's something to that. And as I get older and more crotchety, I believe it even more. The fact is, once upon a time, you could go into the legislature or into Parliament and beat each other's brains out for an hour and then go out for a drink. And it was more collegial. It just was. I see people who've worked in the back rooms nod their head. It just was. I wrote a book about a guy named John Robarts, who was Ontario's 17th Premier, or Prime Minister of Ontario, as the job was then called. And one of the things that he did that I thought was just brilliant was he was holding public hearings on something, and he decided to hold them in the north. And he decided to have all, whatever it was then, I guess 120 some odd members of the Ontario legislature take a train ride together. And not all the Liberals in one car and all the Tories, everybody together. And they took that 24-hour train ride up to Northern Ontario, and they did what they did, and then they came back together. You cannot spend that much time all together looking at each other's pictures of each other's kids, talking about each other's personal stuff. You can't spend that much time together and then be a son of a bitch to somebody when you get back to business. You just can't do it. You know where to draw a line because you know that guy. You know who his wife is. You know who his grandkids are. We don't do that anymore. I notice, unless I've got the wrong impression here, but I don't think I do, anytime I'm in Ottawa and I see people socializing, overwhelmingly, I see Liberals only socializing with Liberals, Tories only with Tories. It is a rare event where people come together in a multi-partisan way. And that kind of, we're only going to socialize with our own and drink our own bathwater, it just doesn't help. So a golden age, I don't know. A better age, I'd go for that. First part of your question now.
The first part of my question was just in reference, you said politics was a harsh world with the backstabbing,
Look,
and then in comparison to how the public interprets how the political...
It's both. Look, I'm not saying that what you hear and read and see on a daily basis is inaccurate. I'm sure it is. I wrote those books because I thought there was more to the story than what you would normally see on your evening news. And there is. I mean, the fact is, what we see on the news every night is a very slender slice of what politicians actually do during the course of their day. If you got your impression of politics only from watching Question Period, and that's it, and that is it, right? That is mostly where we get our news from. Well, I mean, that's an hour out of their day. And it's not the most appetizing hour either. And it doesn't at all reflect what they do for a living. Not at all. But that's what we see. And I'm just trying to paint in my own little modest way a more complete picture of what it is they actually do, what motivates them to get in, and what can sometimes happen to them after they get out. That's all. Trying to even the scales a little bit.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Cheryl Dodson. I'm doing my
Cheryl?
master's. Yes.
Hi, Cheryl.
At the School of Public Policy. And my question is, sort of connects to what you were just talking about, the greater part of a politician's life, and in particular their families, and what can a family do both in the period running for office, being in office, and potentially being removed from office against their will, other than support, like, because that's a pretty broad term, what the families can do to help their politician.
You say other than support, and I would just say there it is right there, beginning, middle, and end. And, you know, forgive me for doing this again, but his story is one I know relatively well. On that train ride that John Robarts took and brought all the other MPPs with him, when he got back to Union Station, he noticed that the then Liberal leader, a guy named Robert Nixon, whose father was Premier of Ontario, he was a former Ontario, he was the Liberal leader at the time, and would go on to become Treasurer in David Peterson's government. Bob Nixon had his wife and 4 kids waiting for him at Union Station when he came back. And Robarts noticed it. And he told it to a reporter, and that reporter who was there told it to me, which is how I know that story. And he was impressed that Mr. Nixon, who was a 37-year-old farmer from St. George, Ontario, no threat to John Robarts, he was impressed and jealous that this 37-year-old farmer/teacher had such support from his family that they would be there for him when he came back from being away for a week up in Northern Ontario. That kind of stuff makes a huge difference. We shouldn't underestimate that at all. That is a big deal. Mr. Robarts had the misfortune of having a wife who disregarded the advice of everybody at the time. While many of the members of the legislature had their families either move to Toronto or had their wives move to Toronto or at least get an apartment in Toronto, his wife refused to move to Toronto. She insisted on staying in London, raising the children in London. She hated politics. She did not support her husband. There was an opening of a library, I remember, 2 blocks from the Robarts' home in London. And it was noted that Mrs. Robarts did not show up to be there with her husband to open the thing. So, you know, if you don't think a supportive spouse matters and a supportive family matters, beginning, middle, and end of story, right there. That's so much of it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Cheryl. Yes?
Hi, my name is Christopher. I'm a second-year law student.
Name again?
Christopher.
Christopher, hi.
Yes, hi. First of all, I'm a big fan of the show.
Thank you.
Second of all, I missed the first half of this because, ironically, I was in a law, state, and constitutional class. So I'm sorry if you've already answered this. But a few months ago, I was watching the Reagan at 100 episode on your show where you were discussing more or less the effects of Reagan, both with his administration and the long-term effects that we're currently seeing play out today. My main question is, and I'm sure you've been asked this quite often, is that seemed to be a very, very lively debate, even with the satellite delay. And I'm curious, how is it that you're able to sort of keep your objectivity? Because being so well versed in politics, I'm assuming United States is definitely for Canada, how is it that your own personal opinions are able to be sort of controlled in a realm of such extreme debate?
Well, first of all, I appreciate the fact that you think I do that, because I do try very hard to do that. And I'll tell you something, it's not that hard. You know why? I like the job. And if you want to keep the job, them's the rules. It really is as simple as that. I mean, we're joking here. We're coming up on the 30th anniversary of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and I'll tell you, I have no free speech rights. I have none compared to any of you out here. I'm certainly not allowed to speak my mind on a whole range of things. And sometimes you're right, I do get asked, doesn't that bug you? And I just say, you know what? I love the job. And if that's part of the price for keeping the job, I'm happy to pay it. The other thing is, you know what? These issues are, I mean, if we're covering them, chances are they're complicated. There's not an easy answer. It's not an obviously this is the right answer and this is so stupid. There are some cases where that's the case. But if we're doing it, it's because there's a debate. And if there's a debate, again, sorry to go back to Robarts, but he always used to say this. Robarts used to say, if a decision gets to my desk, at that point you can probably flip a coin. Because there are so many good arguments on each side. And at that point it's just about being decisive. So I don't have any problem keeping my opinions to myself. because I'm going to have 4 university tuitions to pay for, and I want to make sure I can do that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hi, Steve. My name's Jonathan McDowell.
Hi, Jonathan.
I'm a big fan, too.
Thank you.
I just have a loosely formed question, and it's on the topic of cover-ups. And I know there's a fine line between public and private life.
Speak up a bit, Jonathan.
I know there's a fine line between public and private life.
Okay.
When you're the media covering a politician. And I just think that there's examples where in real life of politicians being pulled over, drunk driving, with cocaine in the car. Just one example, okay?
Who might you be referring to there?
It's the Jaffer case, okay? Right, so everyone is aware.
Actually, I was thinking of somebody else, but it just goes
I think
goes to show you these may not be that unique. Okay.
But you hear the story when it breaks, and there's discussion, which is great. But then, months on down the line, you tend not to hear anything about the disciplinary action. And,
Well,
that's just one case.
In that case, we know what the disciplinary action was. There was a lot of discussion about it at the time.
Okay. Yeah, okay. So, but if the charges were legitimate, then you would expect, you know.
Justice system works in the way it works.
Okay, so I'm just wondering if.
What's the question, Jonathan?
Yeah, I'm just wondering if you could just speak on the topic of issues like this where politicians come.
Okay, let me try and put.
Contact with breaking the law, and you know, there's that gray area of legal or illegal, and you know.
Here's what I'd say about that. The funny thing was, you were mentioning those circumstances, and I was thinking of another politician who, may or may not be the mayor of Toronto today. But anyway, he.
There's just.
I don't think it was cocaine in his case. It was something else.
Half a dozen cases. Right?
My general rule of thumb has been that if a politician has some issue in their private life, and it doesn't affect how they do their public job, then probably we should keep our noses out of it. That's, I think, where most journalists in this country draw the line. They obviously don't draw that line in the same place in the United States. They draw it in a very different place. Everything's fair down there. There's no holds barred. Up here, our line is moving, but I think for the most part, I think reputable journalists try to keep their nose out of politicians' private business unless it affects their ability to do their job. Now, obviously, if charges are laid, it's a public matter, and then you're almost obliged at that point to report on it and to let the electorate make their decisions. What I've noticed that's interesting is that the man who is currently the mayor of Toronto had an enormous amount of negative publicity before his election come out. Some of the things happened 10 years ago in Florida, driving under the influence. Other things happened more recently. Drugs were involved in some of it. None of it seemed to matter. I think we have to say, and I absolutely believe this, the electorate is always right. The people always know. The people will take into account what they think is important, and they will filter out that which may be titillating or interesting, but does not speak to what they genuinely care about. And if they don't care about what Rob Ford did in a car 10 years ago, that they think has no importance to the way he might do his job today, then it's absolutely their right to filter that information away. You may not like it. You may think, how could people possibly elect somebody who has that in their background? But the people are always right. Huey Segal, I remember, the senator, once said a line that he said, "The people are never wrong. Sometimes they're a little excessive, but they're never wrong." I think those are words to live by.
Hi, I have two related questions and can answer.
What's your name?
Andrew Gwynn.
Andrew?
So the first question is, could you comment on some of the pressures that people in the media have to sort of denigrate politicians? Because we hear a lot about how the media is so hard on politicians, but I'd ask if you could speak to some of the real pressures that are on people in the media to report certain things, the pressure that they face in their workplace and so on. And yeah, so we'll go with that one.
Okay. In some respects, that's hard for me to answer because I don't work at the Toronto Star. I don't work at the CBC. I'm just pulling names out of it. I don't work at the Toronto. I don't work at the Ottawa Citizen. I don't work anywhere else, and I don't really know what the relationships between reporters on the ground and their desks are like to be able to offer something up on that. I know what the rules of the road are where I work. I know what the values are that I think we try to follow, and I hope we do a good job of that. I guess the conventional wisdom would suggest that there are mean, irascible editors constantly screaming at the reporters saying, dig up as much dirt as you possibly can. That hasn't been my experience where I've worked. I've worked at a few different places, not just at TVO the most, but I've worked at other places before that, and I've never had an editor say to me, I want you to go out and dig up as much nasty dirt on this person as possible. Everybody loves a good story, and I think we do try to get good stories, but I don't think we try to get people. Now, if a story leads you to getting someone, that's one thing, but I don't know that people, quote unquote, have it out for any particular politicians. That may sound ridiculously naive, but that's been my experience. Second question.
And closely related to that, why do you think politicians seem to get denigrated more than other like just people in different jobs? Like you don't get, say, Don Cherry most of the time at least, just generally tearing a strip off of hockey players as a group, but you do get that almost universally from reporters covering politics.
There's a bunch of answers to that question. Number one, to a certain extent, they do bring it upon themselves. They behave badly from time to time. And anybody, as mentioned before, anybody who made the sum total of their judgments about politicians based on what they see every day in question period would not have a particularly good impression of the way things are. Question period could be, if it were just a little bit wittier or a little bit really on the issues, or I think we remember the days. I see David here. He used to work for John Turner's, and do you remember the days when Trudeau and Mulroney would go at it on the floor of the House of Commons? I mean, there were some good exchanges there. There was some good. The barbs were clever. The issues were generally, hit on the head against each other. Now, some people may say that was a bad time too, but I don't know. My recollection of it was that it was just far less personal and far more on the issues. Maybe this is the haze of my recalling it. So, number one, they bring it upon themselves. Number two, these people have to be accountable to other forces in society far more than anybody else. And, if a truck driver misses a delivery, you're not going to hear about it on the news that night. If a cabinet minister screws up, you are going to hear about it on the news that night. That is just the reality. We pay their salaries. We expect them to be accountable to us. If they disappoint us in any way, they're going to hear about it. Those are the rules of the road. Please. Thank you.
Hi there. My name is Simon, and I'm a student at the University of Ottawa, actually. So I want to thank Carlton for putting on the event. Good job, guys.
You got guts, Simon. Way to go.
My question is actually about the debates. You did both here in Ontario, or in Toronto, and here in Ottawa for the federal election. When I watched the debates, I found that there wasn't a lot of personal connection in between the people speaking and the person watching the TV. And I know you were sitting there, so you might have a better view of what was happening.
Worse.
Is there...
he thinks I'm kidding. It's true. I'll tell you in a second. Keep going.
Is there a real connection in between us and politicians? I believe in politics, but when you watch that, it's hard to really believe anything they're saying. It's hard to feel that connection, feel that they actually care based on their ideological point of view.
Why do you think they don't care?
Well, okay, here's an example. Both Stephen Harper and Dalton McGuinty, when they spoke about the issues, they did not speak to the people they were debating with. They spoke to a camera.
Why do you think?
I'm guessing they figured it was a better public relations type.
They were told to.
They were told to.
Yeah.
So my point is, has that evolved? Are we losing that connection? Because when I see that, then how do I know Mr. Harper is better than Mr. Ignatieff, than Mr. Layton, than Mr. Duceppe, or Dalton, McGinty, and his two other opponents? How do I know that one is better than the other, one knows the issues better? If they can't even talk to themselves, there's no connection there, how am I supposed to have a debate in my own mind with them when I'm just being berated?
Okay, well, part of part of the thing you have to remember, Simon, two things. Number one, I haven't seen that debate. I was there, but I haven't seen it or experienced it in the way you did, right? It's a television experience. That's what it's meant to be. I was sitting there and haven't seen it on TV and can't really say that I experienced it the way you did. They're told to look in the cameras and ignore each other by their handlers because the idea is, I don't want to debate with them, I want to make a direct connection with the viewer at home. And that's why they do that.
It is called a leader's debate.
I understand that. Well, in the same way they call it question period, it's not called question and answer period, right? Okay? Just saying. What they call it and what actually transpires is two different things sometimes. Yes, it's supposed to be a leaders' debate, and we've tried to find a good format that would encourage them to debate amongst themselves as much as possible, this notion of a one-on-one debate off the top and then broaden it out to include the others. But the reality is they are so strenuously coached by their people to ignore the other guy and just make direct contact with that camera and look at Mr. and Mrs. Everyday Ontario or Mr. and Mrs. Everyday Canada. And you know what? I may be up here on this stage with this person, but that doesn't mean I got anything to do with them. I'm making a connection with you. And that's why they do it. So at the end of the day, what can I tell you, Simon? You make your best judgment. You make your best guess. You see what you see, and you take your best shot at it.
I was just wondering in live whether it was any different. You got a different
I'll
sense
tell you what,
on TV.
it's absolutely worse for me, and you thought I was being facetious, but it's true. On the one hand, I'm keeping an eye on a clock to make sure that they don't go over. I'm listening to them tell me in my ear what's going to come up next. I've got my eye down on the question sheet to see what the next question has to be. I'm listening because if there's a follow-up that's required, I need to do that. They are constantly telling me in my ear, Andrea Horvath's a little light on time, so cut this guy off and let her get in there some more. All that is going on. So, if you're wondering why I don't kind of experience it in the way you do, I'm busy. I mean, that's the reality.
Thanks.
Thanks, Simon.
Steve, I'm Darren. I'm a member of Red Sox Nation. I have a quick question for you.
Awesome. Hi, Darren.
You mentioned earlier in your remarks about your son getting bit by the bug, about being inspired. I'm curious about what inspires you in the work that you do. Is it people that you look up to? Is it the ideals that you learned when you were young? Is it the vision for a better country? What inspires you to do the remarkable work that you do?
Okay, first of all, I'm going to let the cat out of the bag here, okay, Darren?
Sure.
Darren's father and I once drove 14 hours to go to Fenway Park and see a baseball game that the Red Sox were playing in, so we've been bitten by that bug as well. So Darren's a longtime family friend, and you are now asking me to do something that I hate to do, which is to talk very personally in public about stuff that's in my head and in my gut. And I really don't ever do that. Number one, it's too self-indulgent and makes me uncomfortable doing it. I'm happy to kind of use this very, I don't know any other way to say it. I have a very privileged position as a guy who gets to sit in a chair and have people come to him and ask them questions about things that I'm curious about. I mean, that's a wonderfully privileged thing to be able to do. And if there is value in my doing that other people see, that's wonderful. And I remember once doing an interview with Martin Short, and I asked him, do you know why you're funny? I said, I think you're really funny. Do you know why you're funny? And he said, not only do I not know, but I never want to ask myself that question. I worry that if I analyze it too much, whatever it is that's inside of me that might be, I don't know, whatever that spark is, I'm worried I might lose it if I kind of analyze this too much. And I'm going to punt this one the same way. I don't like to look too deeply into why I love this so much, Or let me rephrase that. I know why I love this so much, but I'm not really all that comfortable talking and sharing those personal views with everybody else about it. All of those things that were on your list, I'm sure are on my list, and more. And if the Red Sox get a good closer now that Papelbon's left, I'll be a real happy camper. Thanks a lot, everybody. Great to be with you.